In the grand tapestry of Victorian Britain, where empire, progress, and propriety reigned supreme, few figures embodied both reverence and quiet tragedy more than the widow. She was draped in black, veiled from the world, and bound by rules that dictated how she must grieve, how she must live, and how she must die to herself long before her time. Today, we step back into that world of creaking corsets and curtained parlors, of whispered judgments and heavy etiquette, a world that turned sorrow into spectacle and mourning into moral duty. This is not simply the story of loss. It is the story of what came after, of women who found themselves trapped between love and survival, duty and desire, faith and freedom. Behind every photograph of a black-clad figure staring solemnly at the camera lies a hidden history, one of endurance, resilience, and quiet rebellion. So, as the lamps of Victorian England flicker to life and the long shadows of grief stretch across its streets, we invite you to journey with us into a time when death was public, mourning was fashion, and being a widow was a lifetime sentence. Welcome to Why Being a Victorian Widow Sucked More Than Losing Your Husband, a story not only of death, but of what it meant to keep living. Victorian England stood at the height of its power, wealth, and confidence, yet beneath the surface of its empire was a quiet obsession that touched every home, every heart, and every ritual of daily life: the fascination with death. Few societies in modern history have built such an elaborate culture around mourning, and few demanded so much visible suffering from their women. In an age when the average life expectancy was barely 50, and disease, childbirth, and industrial accidents claimed lives without warning, death was a constant visitor. For women, however, widowhood was not merely a tragedy of emotion, but a transformation into a social condition that defined their worth and respectability. The loss of a husband initiated a ritual that reached into every fabric of her life, dictating what she wore, where she could go, what she could say, and even how she should feel. The roots of the Victorian mourning system lay partly in older European traditions of respect for the dead, but what occurred in the 19th century was unlike anything before it. Death became an organized institution, complete with its own etiquette, markets, and moral expectations. To be bereaved was to enter a complex hierarchy of social performance. It was not enough to grieve privately. One had to demonstrate grief through visible and codified behavior. In no case was this more strictly applied than to widows. They were the most conspicuous mourners in British life, expected to embody the virtues of loyalty, piety, and submission through every thread of their attire and every gesture in public. The model for this culture came from the highest level of society. When Prince Albert died in December 1861, Queen Victoria's reaction was so extreme and so enduring that it redefined the national imagination. She retreated into seclusion, ordered her servants to maintain Albert's rooms as though he might return at any moment, and wore black for the remaining 40 years of her life. Her court followed suit. Courtiers, aristocrats, and then the middle classes adopted the symbols of perpetual bereavement as marks of propriety and patriotic sympathy. The Queen's private despair became a public template for moral virtue. To mourn was not merely to express affection for the deceased, but to demonstrate one's moral fiber and social respectability. The market responded with astonishing speed. By the 1860s, London's shopping districts were lined with mourning warehouses, large emporiums that sold every conceivable item in shades of black and gray. Crepe, the dull, crinkled fabric favored for mourning, was in constant demand, as were jet necklaces from Whitby, black parasols, gloves, stationery with black borders, and mourning bonnets with long veils that covered the face to the chin. These shops did not cater only to the elite. They also offered inexpensive versions for the lower and middle classes, ensuring that every woman, regardless of income, could participate in the elaborate theater of bereavement. Manuals on etiquette provided detailed instructions on what to wear and for how long. The first year after a husband's death was to be spent in deep mourning, a period of near-total social withdrawal and strict clothing codes. For 12 months or more, the widow's world was to be black, her garments, her accessories, her very presence subdued to an image of unrelenting sorrow. Such discipline was framed as virtue. The Victorian moral code celebrated restraint, self-sacrifice, and the suppression of personal desires in favor of duty. A widow who adhered to the mourning rules was praised for her fidelity to the memory of her husband. Her self-denial proved her moral worth. Conversely, a woman who appeared cheerful too soon or who failed to wear the correct attire invited suspicion and gossip. Respectability was a fragile commodity in 19th century Britain, and women's reputations could be destroyed by the slightest hint of impropriety. To disregard mourning customs was to risk being branded unfeeling, indecent, or even sexually immoral. The logic was harsh but simple. A virtuous wife would mourn visibly, a heartless one would not. What makes this culture particularly striking to modern eyes is how thoroughly it fused grief with gender. Men who lost their wives were not subjected to the same expectations. A widower might wear a black arm band or a sober suit for a few months, but his mourning was considered dignified precisely because it was understated. Society encouraged him to remarry quickly, to restore domestic order and continue his public role. The widow, by contrast, was expected to withdraw, to transform herself into a living monument of loss. Her sorrow was not only personal but performative, serving as a moral example to others. It was a script written for her by a patriarchal society that valued her chastity and obedience above her happiness. Etiquette books such as The Queen, the Ladies' Newspaper, and Court Chronicle published extensive guides on mourning, listing the exact fabrics, colors, and durations appropriate for each stage of bereavement. They distinguished between first mourning, second mourning, and half mourning, each with its own palette and rules. During the earliest phase, the widow's attire had to be of the dullest black crepe, unadorned by any sheen or decoration. Her jewelry, if worn at all, was to be made of jet, onyx, or hair taken from the deceased, fashioned into rings or lockets. Only after a year might she progress to silk trimmed with black ribbon and eventually to subdued shades of gray, lavender, or mauve. Every step toward color was a symbolic easing of grief. Though even this process was regulated by strict timelines, mourning was treated like a moral apprenticeship. Deviation implied failure of character. The physical discomfort of these garments was immense. Crepe was coarse and irritating to the skin, particularly in damp English weather. The heavy veils impeded vision and airflow, and the multilayered dresses were sweltering in summer. Yet these inconveniences were part of the point. Suffering lent authenticity to mourning. The more uncomfortable the costume, the more sincere the devotion appeared. To wear black was to announce one's piety and endurance. This visual language of grief permeated all public spaces. Theaters, parks, churches, and railway stations filled with women draped in somber fabrics, their presence turning the urban landscape into a tableau of muted sorrow. Beyond fashion, mourning shaped social behavior. A widow in deep mourning was expected to avoid public amusements, parties, or any appearance of gaiety. Visits to friends were limited. Even letters were written on paper bordered with black. Some women covered mirrors or pictures in their homes, adhering to old superstitions about the spirits of the dead. Mourning thus became both a personal discipline and a public spectacle. It affirmed the Victorian conviction that moral virtue could and should be made visible. In an era obsessed with respectability, Grief was yet another form of social currency. What drove this intensity? Partly, it was the high mortality rate of the era. Death touched families so frequently that rituals were needed to make sense of the constant loss. Religion also played a role. The Victorian age was deeply Christian, but it was also a time of anxiety about faith. Science, industrialization, and new philosophies were challenging traditional beliefs about the soul and the afterlife. Mourning customs offered a tangible structure in a world of uncertainty. By adhering to them, people could feel that they were fulfilling divine duty and maintaining a moral order. For women, who were often excluded from public power, mourning provided a sphere in which they could express virtue and command respect, albeit through submission. Yet this system was not without critics. Some contemporary writers noted the hypocrisy of fashionable grief. They observed that the sale of mourning goods had become a form of commercial exploitation, encouraging families to spend beyond their means. The satirical magazine Punch mocked the excesses of the mourning trade, depicting women burdened by absurdly heavy veils and overpriced accessories. Clergymen occasionally preached against the vanity of mourning attire, warning that true sorrow resided in the heart, not in the wardrobe. But these dissenting voices did little to change popular behavior. The social pressure to conform remained overwhelming. For widows, the cost of noncompliance was not merely gossip, but potential social isolation. Neighborhoods, churches, and charitable societies often excluded women who did not observe the correct period of mourning. Employers hesitated to hire them. Acquaintances hesitated to visit them. In middle-class circles, a widow's reputation was intertwined with her visible modesty. The mourning costume functioned as both armor and caget, protected her from scandal, but confined her within an identity of perpetual bereavement. It is telling that etiquette manuals of the time rarely spoke about men's feelings, but devoted pages to instructing women how to display theirs. The widow's grief was not her own to define. It was a public resource, a demonstration of the moral stability of the family and the nation. By performing sorrow correctly, she reaffirmed the social hierarchy in which women were guardians of virtue and men were actors in the world. Even the Queen's mourning served to reinforce this ideal. Her endless devotion to Albert was celebrated as evidence of female purity, turning her private despair into a national lesson on wifely duty. In practice, the experience of mourning varied across class lines. Among the wealthy, professional dressmakers and servants handled the practical burdens, ensuring that the household projected the proper solemnity. In the middle class, the rituals were both moral obligation and financial strain. Families might go into debt to purchase the required clothing and stationery. For the poor, imitation was often impossible. Black dye was expensive and crepe impractical for daily labor. Some dyed existing garments or wore black ribbons as a token of mourning. Charitable organizations occasionally provided second-hand clothing for destitute widows so they could maintain respectability. The irony was clear. Even poverty did not exempt one from the moral expectations of grief. The ubiquity of mourning also had psychological effects. Living in a society saturated with reminders of death blurred the boundary between life and loss. Photographs of deceased relatives were displayed prominently. Some families commissioned mourning portraits, in which the widow appeared alongside a symbolic representation of her husband. Cemeteries became social spaces, landscaped like gardens for Sunday visits. The culture of mourning thus extended beyond the individual widow to shape collective identity. To be Victorian was, in some sense, to be perpetually in mourning. As the century progressed, changes in technology and commerce intensified this phenomenon. The expansion of print media spread advertisements for mourning goods across the country, and the telegraph allowed news of deaths to circulate quickly. prompting immediate displays of condolence. The growth of urban consumer culture turned grief into a marketable commodity. Mourning was not merely endured, it was consumed. Still, the persistence of these customs cannot be understood purely as fashion. They reflected deep anxieties about gender, morality, and control. The widow embodied the fragility of the social order. Her husband's death threatened the stability of the household, and her conduct became a test of how well the system could reassert itself. By demanding that she adhere to strict mourning, society reaffirmed its own structure. Her visible sorrow reassured others that moral order survived even in the face of death. In Victorian Britain, death was not a quiet visitor who slipped unnoticed through the corridors of life. It was a constant, looming presence woven into the very fabric of society. To be a widow in this age was not merely to grieve a husband, it was to inherit an entire way of life defined by ritual, appearance, and social expectation. Mourning had become an institution, a code of conduct as rigid as any law, and no one embodied its burden more heavily than the Victorian widow. She was both a symbol of virtue and a prisoner of convention, her every action governed by the unwritten commandments of respectability. The 19th century witnessed the industrialization of death as surely as it did of steel or textiles. With the expansion of cities, the growth of the middle class, and advances in printing and commerce, mourning itself became a vast enterprise. Funerals were orchestrated with the precision of a factory process. Undertakers, milliners, and drapers all profited from the business of sorrow. Yet for the widow, this cult of mourning was not a choice. Society decreed that her grief must be visible, measurable, and prolonged. The black dress, the veil, the jet jewelry all became part of an intricate vocabulary of bereavement. To deviate from it was to invite scandal or moral suspicion. The origins of this obsession lay partly in the reign of Queen Victoria herself. When Prince Albert died in 1861, the Queen retreated into a lifelong seclusion of mourning, transforming her personal grief into a national ethos. Her black attire and withdrawn demeanor became the model for respectable womanhood, and countless widows, from aristocrats to shopkeepers' wives, found themselves compelled to emulate her. Newspapers, etiquette manuals, and household guides reinforced the standard. A proper widow, readers were told, must observe 2 full years of deep mourning before even considering a lighter shade of gray. Jewelry of gold or silver was forbidden. Only dull jet or black enamel might be worn. Even social visits were restricted. No concerts, no theater, no laughter in public. A widow's duty was to serve as the living monument to her husband's death. For poorer women, this expectation was cruelly impractical. Many widows relied on their husbands' wages to survive. To observe strict mourning meant losing the means to work or to remarry. Yet even in the slums of London or Manchester, the cultural pressure remained. A woman who appeared in anything other than black might be judged as heartless or indecent. Some borrowed or bought second-hand mourning garments at pawnshops. The sight of threadbare black cotton, shiny from overuse, was as common in working-class districts as soot on the chimneys. Mourning had become democratized, a performance of grief that transcended class, though its weight fell heaviest on those least able to bear it. The widow's costume, that emblem of piety and pain, was far more than a fashion statement. The heavy fabrics and layered skirts were deliberately uncomfortable, a physical reminder of loss. The crepe, a crinkled, matte black textile used for mourning, was notorious for shedding fine black dust that clung to skin and lungs. It absorbed moisture, carried the smell of smoke, and faded quickly, forcing frequent replacement. Yet its very ugliness was prized. It signaled humility, the renunciation of vanity. Even in summer, widows were expected to wear long sleeves and high collars, their faces obscured behind a veil of bombazine or tulle. The effect was almost spectral. To meet a widow in full mourning was to confront a figure halfway between the living and the dead. This visual vocabulary extended into every corner of life. Mourning stationery was edged in black. Household mirrors were draped so that the widow might not be tempted by her reflection. Even time itself was measured by the calendar of grief. First deep mourning, then half mourning, then, if one was luckier, release. Etiquette books such as Cassell's Household Guide or The Queen advised on every detail. The first year, one wore dull black crepe without ornament. The second year allowed for the introduction of silk or subdued gray. Only after 2 years could color cautiously return, lavender, lilac, or mauve, symbolic of the fading of sorrow. To abandon black too soon was to invite gossip, perhaps even ostracism. Grief, in Victorian England, was not a private emotion. It was a moral performance, and the widow was its principal actor. The psychological toll of such prolonged ritual cannot easily be measured, but contemporary accounts suggest it was profound. Diaries of the time often reveal a suffocating tension between genuine emotion and social duty. A widow might feel her grief beginning to soften, only to reprimand herself for insufficient piety. Many women described feeling invisible behind the veil, excluded from the normal rhythms of life. Others resented the hypocrisy of a society that demanded outward misery while offering little practical help. Charity for widows existed, but it was limited and moralizing, contingent upon good behavior and the avoidance of scandal. The workhouse or the needle often awaited those who could not sustain the facade of dignified mourning. Victorian mourning was also steeped in superstition and pseudo-science. The boundary between life and death fascinated the era's thinkers, from spiritualists to anatomists. The widow was often cast as the medium between these worlds. Seances and spirit photography flourished, offering the bereaved a chance to communicate with the departed. Some widows, particularly among the middle classes, found comfort, or at least social diversion, in such practices. Yet these rituals also reinforced the notion that the dead husband remained the central presence in his wife's life, even from beyond the grave. Her identity, in the eyes of society, was forever defined by his absence. The economics of mourning were equally oppressive. The cost of funerals, mourning clothes, and memorial paraphernalia could ruin a family. Tradesmen's bills for crepe, gloves, and black bordered stationery mounted quickly, and social pressure made it impossible to economize. In towns and villages alike, mourning warehouses advertised every conceivable item of grief, from black-edged visiting cards to mourning umbrellas. The widow, already deprived of financial security, became a lucrative customer in a market that profited from despair. It was grief commodified. The intersection of religion and mourning further complicated the widow's experience. Victorian Christianity placed heavy emphasis on the virtues of resignation and patience. Clergymen preached that suffering purified the soul, and that submission to God's will was the highest form of faith. For widows, this theology offered both comfort and constraint. To question the justice of one's loss was considered impious. To seek joy again too soon, a kind of betrayal. Religious tracts for women, such as The Mothers of England by Mrs. Sarah Ellis, urged widows to devote themselves entirely to domestic piety and the moral upbringing of their children. Their grief, it was said, should be sanctified through service and humility. The effect was to sanctify endurance rather than alleviate suffering. One striking aspect of Victorian mourning culture was its obsession with visibility. Death, far from being hidden, was made conspicuous. Funerals became public spectacles, and widows were central to their choreography. In cities, funeral processions could stretch for blocks, with horses draped in black, hearse plumes nodding in solemn rhythm, and mourners walking behind in ordered ranks. The widow, veiled and stoic, occupied the front of this procession, a living emblem of fidelity. Her role was less about private emotion than about social performance, confirming the moral order of the community. Even photography played a part. Memento mori, portraits captured widows beside the likeness of their deceased husbands, sometimes literally posed with the coffin or post-mortem images of the dead. To modern eyes, these customs may seem macabre, but to Victorians they were expressions of continuity, a way of keeping the dead present. Yet beneath this elaborate facade, grief could curdle into despair. Medical journals of the time occasionally referred to melancholia of widowhood, a form of prolonged depression induced by isolation and social expectation. Widows were discouraged from remarrying too soon, and many never did, fearing the censure of neighbors or the loss of their widow's pension. For middle-class women with limited legal rights, widowhood could mean a precarious independence at best. They might manage a boarding house, teach music, or take in sewing, but most occupations were closed to them. The image of the dignified, self-sacrificing widow masked an underlying reality of economic vulnerability and loneliness. Even architecture reflected this culture of mourning. Cemeteries expanded on the outskirts of cities, designed as landscaped parks where the living could promenade among the dead. Mausoleums and elaborate headstones testified to the moral virtue of the deceased and, by extension, of the widow who commissioned them. Funerary symbolism, urns, broken columns, weeping angels, became an art form reproduced on jewelry, stationery, and household decor. The home itself often served as a shrine, a lock of the husband's hair in a locket, his portrait draped in black ribbon, his favorite chair left empty. Such practices blurred the boundary between remembrance and obsession, transforming domestic space into a perpetual memorial. By the late Victorian period, some social critics began to question this culture of excessive mourning. Magazines such as Punch satirized the professional widow, forever cloaked in black and resistant to cheer. The rise of aestheticism and the new woman movement of the 1890s challenged the moral codes that bound women to perpetual grief. Yet the old habits persisted well into the early 20th century, especially among the conservative middle classes. The First World War would finally erode the old mourning system, overwhelming it with mass bereavement and practical necessity. But in the high Victorian age, the widow remained the cornerstone of a national obsession with death, an emblem of virtue built on suffering. What made the Victorian widow's predicament especially cruel was the contradiction between moral ideal and lived experience. Society exalted her as a figure of devotion and purity, yet treated her as a social inconvenience once her husband's coffin had been lowered into the ground. A widow of modest means often discovered that her husband's family viewed her as an unwelcome expense. Widows of the laboring classes were left to face the poor law, where relief came only after a humiliating inquiry into their conduct. To obtain parish aid, a woman might have to prove she had not been improper since her husband's death, as if virtue itself could feed her children. The sentimental poetry and sermons that idealized widowhood rarely acknowledged these realities. The law compounded their troubles. Before the Married Women's Property Acts of the 1870s and 1880s, a wife's earnings and possessions legally belonged to her husband. When he died, everything depended on his will, if there was one. Widows could find themselves dispossessed overnight, their household goods claimed by creditors or distant relatives. Even inheritance of a cottage or shop could be contested. Some women were forced to sell their wedding rings or furniture to pay debts, while others entered domestic service to survive. Legal reform would eventually grant women more financial autonomy, but for much of the century, widowhood exposed the fragility of a woman's security in a patriarchal society. Cultural expectation offered little comfort. Popular literature was filled with images of the noble widow. Pious, industrious, and self-effacing, she appeared in moral tales, Sunday school tracts, and sentimental novels as the embodiment of Christian resignation. The poet Felicia Hemans had written earlier in the century of the lone mother bending o'er her infant's grave, and later authors recycled the trope endlessly. Such portraits reinforced the idea that a good widow's chief virtue was endurance. If she suffered in silence, she was saintly. If she remarried, she risked being portrayed as mercenary or frivolous. Literature thus shaped social expectation, ensuring that countless real women felt compelled to live up to impossible standards. The business of mourning continued to thrive. By mid-century, entire districts of London catered to the trade. On Regent Street and in Kensington, specialized shops displayed bolts of black crepe and mourning accessories in their windows year-round. Advertisements promised mourning complete in 24 hours, offering bereaved customers a ready-made uniform of sorrow. Catalogs from suppliers like Jay's Mourning Warehouse listed hundreds of items: bombazine gowns, crepe collars, jet earrings, black bordered handkerchiefs, and mourning bonnets. Even children's clothes came in miniature black versions. The sheer scale of this commerce reflected a society that had turned grief into both spectacle and consumption. Behind the counter, however, the commerce of mourning exposed class distinctions with brutal clarity. The wealthy could afford the best fabrics, fresh each season. The poor relied on cast-offs or dyed garments. Some women used black dye made from logwood and iron salts, which quickly stained the skin and ruined cloth. Washing and ironing mourning clothes was an ordeal. Crepe could not be pressed without losing its crinkle, so garments had to be dried carefully in darkened rooms. The black dye bled easily, discoloring linens and even food if hung indoors. Maintaining the widow's costume was labor, intensive, expensive, and unhealthy, yet failure to do so meant social disgrace. Etiquette extended its reach into correspondence and conversation. Letters were written on black, edged paper for months or even years. The width of the border signaled the stage of mourning. Invitations to social events were declined with formulaic phrases expressing continued affliction. A widow's very language was policed. Too cheerful a tone might suggest irreverence. Manuals instructed women on how to express grief with propriety, warning against immoderate lamentation. Tears were acceptable, laughter was not. In this linguistic cage, many widows learned to translate their private sorrow into the approved vocabulary of respectability. The performance of mourning became second nature, an armor against judgment. Medical observers of the time began to note the physical consequences of such repression. Prolonged wearing of heavy crepe was blamed for widow's weeds poisoning, a form of respiratory illness caused by inhaling the dye particles. Doctors reported cases of fainting and nervous collapse linked to tight corseting and lack of sunlight under the mourning veil. Others spoke of moral shock or nervous exhaustion, early diagnoses of what we might now call depression. Yet treatment usually consisted of rest, prayer, or a change of air remedies that ignored the social roots of the condition. The widow's suffering was pathologized, but rarely questioned. In the domestic sphere, mourning shaped the rhythms of daily life. Curtains were drawn, Clocks stopped at the hour of death and household mirrors covered with cloth. Visitors entered on tiptoe, speaking in hushed tones. Meals became perfunctory, conversation muted. The widow's home was transformed into a shrine where the past overshadowed the present. Children were often drawn into these rituals, learning early the language of loss. Some widows kept their husbands' clothes hanging untouched for years. Others preserved locks of hair in brooches or miniature cases. Every object became a relic, charged with memory and pain. This culture of perpetual remembrance reflected a deeper anxiety within Victorian society. Industrial progress and urban expansion had disrupted traditional communities, creating new forms of anonymity and insecurity. Death, once a familiar part of village life, became abstracted and institutionalized. The elaborate mourning customs served to domesticate death, to give it moral and emotional structure. The widow, as the visible guardian of memory, reassured society that continuity endured amid change. Her suffering, publicly displayed, affirmed the values of family, faith, and duty that underpinned the Victorian moral order. Yet for the women themselves, it often meant a lifetime suspended between past and future. By the 1880s and 1890s, cracks began to appear in the edifice. Economic realities forced many widows to challenge convention. The expansion of clerical work and education offered limited opportunities for employment. Charity organizations advocated for more practical support rather than endless ritual. Feminist writers such as Mona Caird and Olive Schreiner criticized the social expectation that women live in the shadow of men's memories. The so-called rational dress of movement even attacked mourning clothes as unhealthy and oppressive. Still, tradition proved resilient. When Queen Victoria herself died in 1901, newspapers noted with approval that she had remained in mourning for 40 years, proof that the ideal of the eternal widow had not yet lost its power. The final decades of the 19th century thus witnessed a curious paradox. As Britain grew more secular and modern, its obsession with mourning intensified. New technologies, photography, printing, and mass production spread the imagery of death further than ever before. Mourning jewelry made of jet or human hair became fashionable among young women who had never been widowed. Cemeteries expanded into vast suburban necropolises, their monuments proclaiming permanence amid an age of flux. The widow, still wrapped in black, remained both participant and prisoner in this spectacle of mortality. To understand why being a Victorian widow was so miserable, one must see how completely her identity was subsumed by the expectations of others. Grief was not hers to express freely. It was something prescribed, timed, and displayed. Her clothing, her movements, her very emotions were regulated by etiquette, religion, and commerce. Society demanded that she embody loss so that others might be reassured of their own moral stability. She carried the weight of the era's fear of change, its longing for moral certainty in an age of industrial upheaval. And when her public duty ended, she was often left impoverished, isolated, and forgotten. The tragedy of Victorian widowhood lay not only in personal bereavement, but in the collective insistence that grief be monumental, visible, and endless. The same culture that exalted the sanctity of home denied widows the comfort of private healing. The cult of mourning turned sorrow into spectacle and remembrance into restraint. Beneath the crepe and ceremony, countless women endured silent despair, their humanity obscured by the very rituals meant to honor it. To be a Victorian widow was to live in the shadow of death, not merely one's husband's death, but the death of one's own freedom to live anew. When the 20th century dawned, the old rituals began to crumble. The First World War brought mass mourning on a scale that made individual display impossible. black cloth shortages, practical necessity, and shifting attitudes finally weakened the iron code that had bound widows for generations. Yet the legacy of that culture lingered. Even in later decades, the image of the solemn, veiled widow persisted in art and memory, a relic of an age that found beauty in sorrow and morality in suffering. Looking back, it becomes clear that the Victorian widow was both victim and symbol, victim of economic dependence and social hypocrisy, symbol of a civilization obsessed with virtue through pain. Her story reveals not only the hardships of one group of women, but the moral psychology of an entire era, a society that feared joy as much as death, and that taught its daughters to measure love by the endurance of grief. The widow's weeds may have faded, the mourning warehouses may have closed, but the echo of that cult of mourning remains, a reminder of how profoundly the Victorians shaped our understanding of loss, respectability, and the uneasy dignity of sorrow. In the Victorian world, money and morality were inseparable, and nowhere did this connection reveal itself more starkly than in the experience of widowhood. The death of a husband was not only an emotional catastrophe, but a financial reckoning. For most women, it meant the abrupt collapse of the economic structure that sustained their lives. Respectability in the 19th century depended upon stability of income, of class, of appearance. When a husband died, that stability vanished overnight, and a widow was left to navigate a system that defined her worth through dependence, yet offered little protection when that dependence was destroyed. The phrase widow's poverty was common in social reports of the era. Investigators such as Henry Mayhew and Charles Booth documented the precarious existence of women whose husbands' deaths had pushed them into destitution. In the crowded districts of London or the industrial towns of the North, widowhood often meant a fall from the fragile respectability that separated the working poor from the pauper class. A single week's missed rent could force eviction. Pawnshops thrived on the trade in mourning clothes and household goods. The black garments that signified virtue might themselves end up behind the pawnbroker's glass, exchanged for a few shillings to buy bread. For middle-class women, the shock could be equally severe, though it manifested differently. Respectability demanded a certain lifestyle, a servant or two, a well-kept home, decent clothing for public appearances. These were not luxuries but symbols of moral standing, yet without a husband's salary or business income, maintaining them was nearly impossible. Many widows of clerks, shopkeepers, or minor professionals discovered that their households, built on credit and fragile confidence, were unsustainable. Selling furniture or moving to cheaper lodgings threatened social humiliation. Widows learned to disguise decline, dismissing servants under the pretense of downsizing, selling jewelry discreetly, avoiding old acquaintances who might notice the fraying of their respectability. At the root of this insecurity lay the legal framework of marriage itself. Until the Married Women's Property Act of 1870, and more fully the 1882 Act, a wife's earnings, inheritance, and possessions automatically became her husband's property. He could invest, squander, or bequeath them as he pleased. When he died, the widow's rights were limited to what he had explicitly left in his will. If he died intestate, the law favored male relatives. In practice, many widows discovered that they owned nothing outright, not the house they lived in, nor even the furniture they had chosen. Creditors could seize goods to settle debts incurred by the deceased husband. The idea of the penniless widow was not sentimental exaggeration but common reality. Upper-class women were cushioned by settlements and dowries, yet even they were constrained. A titled widow, styled a dowager, might retain a portion of the estate or an annuity, but she was expected to vacate the family seat for the heir, often a son or nephew. Her life was one of genteel exile, living in smaller quarters and supervising memorial charities while preserving appearances. In letters and diaries, many such women lamented their loss of influence once the new master took possession. They became figures of decorum, tolerated but peripheral, living reminders of mortality amid the continuity of lineage. Among the working classes, economics stripped mourning of its romantic veneer. A laborer's death removed the sole wage from the household. Without income, widows turned to any available work: quashing, cheering, sewing, hawking goods on the street. Some took lodgers or remarried quickly, not out of affection but survival. Social moralists condemned such haste, yet offered no alternative. Parish relief required proof of destitution and moral worthiness. Widows suspected of immorality or drunkenness were denied aid. The new Poor Law of 1834 made assistance deliberately unpleasant, forcing many into the workhouse. There, widows were separated from their children and subjected to harsh discipline. To be a widow without means was to walk a narrow path between hunger and humiliation. Insurance was one of the few mechanisms available to mitigate this risk, and it became a booming industry. By the 1850s, industrial insurance societies targeted the working classes with penny-a-week policies promising small death benefits. Advertisements assured husbands that they could protect their wives from the disgrace of a pauper's funeral. Yet even this supposed safeguard carried irony. Many families struggled to keep up the weekly premiums, and lapsed policies meant lost coverage just when tragedy struck. Agents collected door-to-door, and suspicion of exploitation was widespread. Still, the promise of a decent burial and of respectability preserved beyond the grave kept millions enrolled. The economics of death thus extended into the lives of the living long before loss occurred. For the middle class, life assurance represented both prudence and moral virtue. A responsible man insured his life to provide for his dependents. Failure to do so was seen as negligence. Newspapers carried moralizing editorials urging readers to secure the comfort of your widow. Yet the system itself privileged men's agency. Policies were written in their names. Widows were beneficiaries only insofar as their husbands had been farsighted enough to pay the premiums. When companies failed or disputes arose, litigation could drag on for years, leaving widows in limbo. The legal correspondence of the period is filled with petitions from women pleading for the release of funds withheld on technicalities, a missing signature, an unpaid quarter's premium, or ambiguous medical clause. Charitable organizations attempted to fill the void. Societies such as the Royal Female Orphan Home and the Society for the Relief of Widows and Orphans of Clergymen dispensed small pensions to deserving cases. But deserving carried moral connotations. Recipients had to demonstrate virtue, industriousness, and gratitude. Widows of tradesmen or artisans formed mutual aid societies, pooling resources for funerals and small grants. These networks provided solidarity but little security. The sums involved barely covered rent or schooling fees. Still, they offered psychological comfort, a sense of belonging in a world that otherwise treated widowhood as marginal and pitiable. The marketplace of mourning exploited these insecurities with remarkable efficiency. Undertakers, drapers, and printers all marketed their goods as expressions of duty. An advertisement might assure a widow that nothing so honors the departed as propriety in attire. This rhetoric of moral consumption persuaded women to spend beyond their means. Shopkeepers extended credit for funeral expenses, confident that social shame would compel repayment. Mourning thus became a debt trap. Contemporary reformers noted the paradox. A widow who economized was judged heartless, yet extravagance could ruin her. Respectability demanded both restraint and expenditure, a contradiction that defined much of Victorian life. Some widows sought new livelihoods through craft and trade. Dressmaking, millinery, and teaching were among the few respectable occupations open to women. The very skills associated with femininity, sewing, needlework, domestic management, became survival tools. Yet the market was saturated. A report from the 1880s estimated that in London alone there were over 20,000 seamstresses, many earning less than subsistence wages. The term white slavery was sometimes used to describe their conditions. Long hours bent over dimly lit workrooms ruined health and eyesight. For widows supporting children, the pressure was relentless. Their lives embodied the cruel arithmetic of the industrial economy, endless labor exchanged for mere survival. Education reform offered limited hope. By the late century, teacher training colleges admitted women, and some widows found positions in elementary schools. Others became governesses in middle-class households, though this role carried its own indignities: low pay, isolation, and dependence on employers' whims. Still, compared to the alternatives, it provided a measure of dignity. Periodicals occasionally printed sentimental tales of the virtuous widow turned schoolmistress, instructing youth in both scholarship and Christian fortitude. Such narratives comforted readers by turning economic necessity into moral parable. Remarriage remained the most practical solution to poverty, but it came at a social cost. Etiquette demanded a suitable interval of mourning, 1 year for respectability, 2 for propriety. To marry sooner invited gossip and accusations of callousness. Yet many could not wait. Census records reveal a surprising number of widows remarrying within months, particularly in working-class districts where child care and income were urgent concerns. Moralists scolded, neighbors sometimes whispered. But hunger had little patience for convention. The Victorian ideal of eternal fidelity, modeled on Queen Victoria herself, was a luxury of those who could afford grief. Philanthropists and social commentators debated the problem of widows. Some viewed them as symbols of moral virtue deserving compassion. Others saw them as social liabilities. The feminist writer Harriet Martineau argued that economic dependence, not emotional weakness, was the root cause of widows' misery. Her essays called for property rights and access to employment, insisting that charity could never replace justice. Yet her ideas gained slow traction. The dominant narrative continued to romanticize female self-sacrifice while ignoring structural inequality. By the 1870s, industrial expansion had drawn thousands of women into factories, and widows joined their ranks. Textile mills, matchworks, and tobacco factories employed large numbers of female workers at pitiful wages. Reports of industrial accidents and diseases, phossy jaw among match girls, lung ailments among weavers, underscored the human cost of survival. Still, the income, however small, represented independence. Some widows formed early trade union branches, campaigning for fair pay and safer conditions. Their participation signaled a quiet rebellion against the notion that women should endure hardship silently. Economic necessity had forced a form of proto-feminism, though few at the time used the word. In rural districts, the picture was bleaker. Agricultural labor left widows with little recourse beyond parish charity or fieldwork. Cottage industries such as lace-making or straw plaiting provided meager income. Seasonal employment meant months of insecurity. The stereotype of the weed widow, stooped, thin, clad in eternal black, was a familiar sight in country villages. Folk songs and local tales often depicted her as tragic but morally pure, a symbol of endurance against fate. Behind the sentimentality lay grinding poverty. Even within philanthropy, class prejudice persisted. Middle-class donors expected gratitude and deference. Recipients were required to attend church and submit to moral inspection. Some charities insisted that widows send their children to Sunday school as a condition of aid. Others distributed coal or clothing only at Christmas, turning assistance into spectacle. The line between charity and control was thin. As one critic observed, "We teach the widow humility by starving her slowly." When the husband died in Victorian Britain, his wife did not merely lose a companion, she often lost her entire social and financial identity. Marriage in that age was not only a personal covenant, but also an economic contract, one that tied a woman's legal existence almost completely to that of her husband. The moment he died, the Victorian widow entered a treacherous social and economic terrain, where respectability and survival were bound up in paradoxical expectations. Society told her to live modestly, but also demanded she maintain appearances. She was supposed to remain fragile yet self-sufficient, to mourn sincerely but not sink into visible desperation. The cruel irony was that the very system that praised her for being a faithful wife gave her little means to exist once her husband was gone. In early Victorian law, a married woman's rights were nearly invisible. Under the doctrine of coverture, her property, her wages, and even her legal personhood were absorbed into her husband's identity. A wife could not own land, sign contracts, or claim wages in her own name. So when a husband died, his widow might find herself legally powerless to access the very wealth she had helped sustain. Unless her husband had left a will specifying her inheritance, she could be left with nothing. Even if he had, property laws often favored male heirs, sons, brothers, or distant uncles over the widow herself. It was a legal landscape built on the assumption that women were dependents, never proprietors. For the middle classes, this economic blow could be devastating. A clerk's widow might be forced to move from a respectable townhouse to a single rented room. A merchant's wife, who once managed servants and entertained guests, could suddenly find herself pawning furniture to pay rent. The social fall was not simply about loss of money, it was about loss of status. In Victorian Britain, class identity was a performance, and widows were expected to continue performing even when the means to do so were gone. The black dress, the mourning veil, the subdued carriage, all were part of that act. Yet each item came with a price tag. Mourning attire was expensive, and social propriety demanded that it be worn for a set duration, 2 years for a husband's death, longer if one wanted to show true feeling. To not mourn properly was to risk social judgment. To mourn properly was to risk financial ruin. Among the working classes, the situation was harsher still. The death of a husband often meant the loss of the family's sole income. Widows in industrial towns like Manchester or Birmingham faced a grim choice: accept charity, enter domestic service, or send their children to work. Some took in lodgers, but that came with moral peril. Lodging men could tarnish a widow's reputation. Others turned to laundry work or sewing, the few trades open to women, but the pay was meager. The needle became a symbol of widowhood, both a lifeline and a chain. To sit for 16 hours a day stitching garments for pennies was considered virtuous labor, but it barely kept food on the table. Victorian charity societies often stepped in, but their help came with conditions. Widows were judged not only by need but by moral worth. A deserving widow was one who remained chaste, sober, and submissive. If she was young and attractive, she was often suspected of impropriety. Many charitable institutions preferred older widows, whose widowhood was seen as safely asexual. The rest were advised to remarry, an idea that sounded practical but carried its own stigma. A woman who remarried too soon was branded heartless. One who waited too long risked destitution. The widow's fate was thus trapped between social judgment and financial desperation. Pensions and state assistance were practically non-existent for most widows. The only government support came through the poor law, which offered minimal relief under harsh conditions. A widow seeking parish aid might be forced into the workhouse, where families were split up and dignity erased. The Victorian workhouse was a grim monument to moralistic poverty policy, designed not to help but to deter. To ask for relief was seen as failure. Widows who entered its doors were often regarded as morally deficient, regardless of circumstance. For many, the only alternative was to scrape together survival through small trades or dependence on relatives. But even relatives could be reluctant to help. A widowed sister or daughter was another mouth to feed. Among the middle and upper classes, widows with means had other challenges. A wealthy widow might inherit property or investments, but even then, her autonomy was limited. Society viewed her newfound control over money with suspicion. Inheritance gave her power, but it also made her a target. Unscrupulous suitors, lawyers, and relatives often hovered, eager to advise her finances into their own hands. The idea of a financially independent woman unsettled Victorian sensibilities. Newspapers and novels of the time are full of anxious depictions of widows, scheming, seductive, dangerous precisely because they were unattached and self-reliant. In real life, most were simply trying to manage estates that had been designed for male oversight. Insurance, a new and growing industry in the 19th century, offered one of the few modern lifelines. But life insurance was expensive, and the working poor rarely afforded it. For those who did, the payout often went not to the widow, but to settle debts. Many companies even charged higher premiums for older men, making the cost prohibitive. Thus, while middle-class reformers hailed insurance as a sign of progress, it was progress only for those already comfortable. Economically, widowhood was also entwined with morality. The Victorian ethic of self-help, popularized by writers like Samuel Smiles, taught that poverty was a moral failing. Widows were expected to display cheerful endurance, even gratitude for small mercies. Begging, drinking, or complaining risked branding them as fallen. The widow who cried too loudly was pitied at best, condemned at worst. Yet silence had its cost. Without public advocacy, their plight remained largely invisible. There were some attempts to improve the widow's lot. Friendly societies, mutual aid groups where workers paid small weekly dues, sometimes offered modest death benefits. Religious organizations, particularly Methodist and Anglican charities, distributed food or rent money. Later in the century, feminist campaigners began to agitate for property rights. The Married Women's Property Acts of 1870 and 1882 finally allowed wives to own and control property in their own names. For widows, this meant a degree of independence their mothers had never known, but progress was slow, and many died before those reforms reached them. The cruelest part of widowhood was not always the hunger or hardship, but the invisibility. Society sentimentalized widows in literature. Think of Dickens's gentle, grieving women, but treated real ones as inconveniences. They were too poor for comfort, too visible for denial, too respectable to be dismissed outright. The widow existed on the margins of Victorian morality, both sacred and suspect. She was expected to embody feminine virtue, yet forbidden from fully living again. In many ways, the widow's economic suffering was a mirror of Victorian society itself, a world obsessed with appearances, built on unequal foundations. Beneath the surface of black crepe and moral rhetoric lay a brutal truth, that respectability was often purchased at the expense of survival. A widow could maintain her dignity, or she could eat, but rarely both. Those who dared to challenge this order, to start businesses, to speak out, to live without apology, were often branded as unwomanly. Yet their defiance planted the seeds of later change. By the close of the 19th century, industrialization, urban charity, and legal reform had begun to alter the landscape, but not the underlying prejudice. The image of the sorrowful widow remained a moral ideal, a symbol of piety and restraint. The reality was something far harsher, a class of women caught between reverence and ruin, surviving in a world that honored their tears but ignored their needs. The Victorian widow did not only grieve in silence, she grieved in uniform. Mourning was not merely an emotional state. It was an elaborate, codified ritual written on the body itself. The widow's black dress was both her badge and her burden, a symbol of loss that became a prison of fabric, convention, and expectation. Nowhere in history had clothing been so tightly woven into the moral fabric of grief. The Victorians turned sorrow into spectacle, and the widow became its unwilling mannequin. In 19th century Britain, mourning dress was a serious business, regulated, costly, and steeped in etiquette. It was not enough for a widow to feel grief, she had to display it correctly. Manuals of etiquette, such as the Queen magazine or Cassell's guides, prescribed in minute detail what fabrics, colors, and accessories were appropriate for each stage of mourning. The period immediately following a husband's death was called deep mourning. During this phase, the widow was expected to dress entirely in matte black. No shine, no ornament, no compromise. The preferred fabric was crepe, a stiff, scratchy textile with a dull finish that absorbed light and offered no hint of comfort. Crepe was the very texture of bereavement. Its surface was rough, its structure unyielding. It was said to symbolize the desolation of the heart, but for those who wore it daily, it was a form of physical punishment. It irritated the skin, trapped heat, and collected dust. The heavy folds of black absorbed summer sun and winter soot alike, turning the widow into a walking shroud. Yet, to appear without it was to invite social condemnation. In polite society, mourning attire was proof of moral respectability, visible sign of inner virtue. The production and sale of mourning clothes grew into one of the most profitable industries of the Victorian age. Entire emporiums were devoted to grief. The most famous of all was Jay's Mourning Warehouse on Regent Street in London, an establishment so vast and specialized that it became known as the London General Mourning Warehouse. Here, one could buy everything from full mourning gowns to veils, gloves, handkerchiefs, fans, jewelry, stationery, and even black-edged envelopes. The store catered to every level of society, promising that even the humblest widow could appear properly somber. Advertisements assured customers that their sorrow would be expressed with tasteful propriety. Death, it turned out, was good business. Behind this industry lay a culture that equated grief with respectability. A widow's conduct reflected not just on herself but on her late husband's honor. Her clothing became a public statement of loyalty, proof that she mourned deeply enough, visibly enough. If she dressed too modestly, she risked seeming indifferent; too luxuriously, and she was accused of vanity. There was a narrow path between propriety and hypocrisy, and it was lined with crepe. The rules extended far beyond the dress itself. Jewelry was forbidden in the first year of mourning, except for black jet ornaments, usually carved from Whitby jet, a glossy black fossilized wood mined from the cliffs of Yorkshire. Jet became one of the century's most distinctive symbols of widowhood. It adorned brooches, lockets, and earrings, often engraved with the initials or portrait of the deceased. Queen Victoria herself made jet jewelry fashionable after the death of Prince Albert in 1861. Her decades long mourning set the tone for an entire empire. For 40 years she wore black. For 40 years her court followed suit. This royal example gave mourning dress the weight of national tradition. To wear color was to betray the Queen's grief. Across Britain, society followed the sovereign's sorrow like a moral commandment. Even shopkeepers draped their windows in black. Newspapers printed black borders. The empire itself seemed to dim its palate in sympathy. What began as personal mourning became a social institution, a kind of emotional discipline that linked piety, patriotism, and fashion. But for ordinary widows, especially those of limited means, this expectation was ruinous. The cost of proper mourning attire could rival a family's annual income. Full mourning required multiple garments, dresses, veils, bonnets, petticoats, gloves, parasols, all in black, all freshly made. Ready-made clothing was rare before the 1880s, so many women had to commission dresses from seamstresses or purchase fabric and sew them by hand. Those who could not afford new clothes often dyed their old ones, using cheap dyes that faded or stained their skin. Some resorted to wearing borrowed or second-hand mourning attire, creating a brisk trade in used garments that passed from one bereaved woman to another. The dyeing process itself was grimly symbolic. Dyers specialized in mourning orders, turning bright gowns into dark imitations of sorrow. The chemical dyes of the era were harsh and often poisonous, containing substances like aniline or arsenic-based compounds. Workers in dye houses suffered burns and respiratory problems. Widows who wore these clothes endured itching, rashes, and skin discoloration. Black clothing, in the most literal sense, made them ill. Yet society called this endurance noble. The mourning veil, another essential item, was perhaps the most oppressive symbol of all. Made of crepe or heavy tulle, it hung over the widow's face like a curtain of shadows, often reaching the waist or knees. Etiquette dictated that she wear it outdoors for the first year, sometimes even indoors in the presence of strangers. The veil obscured vision, restricted breathing, and clung to the mouth in damp weather. It absorbed soot and smells from the gaslit streets, yet to appear unveiled was to risk gossip. Contemporary satirists joked that widows could recognize one another by the sound of coughing through layers of crepe. The physical discomfort of these garments was matched by their psychological weight. Mourning attire was a form of social surveillance. It announced one's grief to the world whether one wished it or not. A woman could not step into the street without being marked by her loss. Every glance from a passerby, every whisper in a shop, reminded her that her identity had been rewritten in black ink. The widow's body became public property, her sorrow subject to inspection. There was also a strict timetable for mourning dress. According to etiquette, a widow was expected to remain in deep mourning for 12 months, followed by second mourning for another 6, and half mourning for an additional 6. Each phase allowed for gradual reintroduction of color, first gray or lavender, then mauve, and finally soft white trims. To move through these stages too quickly was scandalous. To linger too long risked being seen as maudlin or morbid. The widow's wardrobe thus became a calendar of grief, its shades charting the acceptable pace of emotional recovery. Magazines and manuals reinforced these rules with relentless precision. They warned women against the dangers of frivolity, urging them to maintain sobriety in both dress and demeanor. Mourning, they insisted, was a moral discipline. Even domestic interiors were to follow suit. Homes were draped in black crepe, mirrors covered, and social visits restricted. Mourning became not just a state of mind, but an architecture of absence, a transformation of the very spaces women inhabited. The psychological toll of this ritualized grief was immense. To be perpetually surrounded by symbols of death was to live in a kind of aesthetic tomb. The widow could not escape her loss even for a moment. It clung to her skin, her walls, her furniture, and while men, after a few months, might return to muted suits and social engagements, women were expected to carry their bereavement like a badge for years. The gender divide in mourning etiquette was stark. Society forgave men for moving on. It condemned women for doing the same. The double standard was obvious to anyone who cared to look. A widower might don a black arm, band, or wear dark suits for a few months before returning to color and company. His grief, though publicly acknowledged, did not imprison him. A widow, by contrast, was bound by fabric and ritual to remain in a state of symbolic death. The black gown became not only her costume, but her confinement. It was a silent declaration that her life, too, had ended, if not in body, then in social meaning. The moral logic behind this unequal burden was rooted in Victorian ideals of femininity. Women were believed to be naturally more emotional, more delicate, and more devoted to domestic feeling. Therefore, society demanded that they perform grief more visibly and for longer periods. The sincerity of their love was measured by the depth of their mourning. A woman who resumed bright clothing too soon was branded heartless, as if joy were an act of betrayal. Even laughter or conversation could be seen as inappropriate. Etiquette books advised widows to avoid public amusements, concerts, or even church fairs during the early stages of mourning. To take pleasure in anything was to dishonor the dead. In this way, mourning dress became a form of moral surveillance. It allowed society to read and regulate the emotions of women. The widow's wardrobe told the world whether she was virtuous, obedient, and properly subdued. Yet beneath that moral surface lay a profound cruelty. Grief had been turned into performance, and failure to perform correctly invited disgrace. The fabric that symbolized fidelity also ensured submission. Queen Victoria's influence loomed over this system like a shadow that would not fade. After Prince Albert's death, her lifelong mourning set the ultimate example of wifely devotion. The Queen's black gowns, her withdrawal from public life, and her refusal to remarry elevated widowhood into a national virtue. It became, in effect, a royal duty to grieve forever. For middle-class women, this model was both inspirational and suffocating. It sanctified their sorrow but denied their recovery. The Queen's mourning had become the empire's morality, and it left little room for women to choose another path. But for all its solemnity, the mourning system also revealed the hypocrisies of class. The wealthy could afford to mourn properly, ordering new gowns, veils, and jewelry for each phase of bereavement. They could send servants to dye fabrics, hire dressmakers, and even purchase mourning stationery embossed with black borders. For them, grief was a luxury that could be performed with elegance. Poorer widows, by contrast, struggled to meet these expectations. Their mourning clothes were often threadbare, second-hand, or crudely dyed, exposing them to gossip and pity. A badly dressed widow was seen not just as poor, but as morally deficient, her shabby black reed as evidence of spiritual neglect. Thus, the culture of mourning reinforced class hierarchy as effectively as any social register. Fashion magazines, ever alert to profit, turned grief into an aesthetic. They printed illustrations of mourning gowns alongside advertisements.